All right, hi everyone. My name is Hayden Gerhardt. This is my level 2 capstone project where I'll be outlining a scenario or a case study athlete for purposes of completing programming, description, etc. First, I'll start with just a brief explanation of who I am, just a little bit about me. I do teach exercise physiology at Grove City College in Grove City, Pennsylvania. I'm involved in a few different organizations. All listed at the top here. I have certification and credential through the National Strength and Conditioning Association as a certified strength and conditioning specialist. I'm a certified exercise physiologist through the ACSM or the American College of Sports Medicine, of course, USAT Level 1. But I'm also just kind of involved in a little bit of everything. I threw some recent publications up here. You'll see I have a little bit of everything in terms of environmental physiology, cold-induced vasodilation in hypoxia or, simulated altitude. I look at carb ingestion, and you'll see there's a triathlete study in there. Carb ingestion eliminates hypoglycemia, improves endurance exercise performance in triathletes, etc. You'll see a couple of those in here. Exogenous ketone studies, dietary habits, both acute and chronic. I've done some research with the tactical athlete or EMT students and personnel like that, so first responder types of research in different hot, humid environments, some palm cooling stuff. So honestly, a little bit of everything. You also see Hill Pursuit on there. That's actually the name of my coaching business. I've coached a handful of World Championship Qualifiers in terms of both distances, 140.6 and 70.3. Recently, the past couple of years, I got into ultramarathon coaching, a little bit of ultramarathon racing myself, but so I've coached a handful of 100-mile athletes. I coached a Cocodona finisher, 300-plus mile Arizona Monster finisher, a little bit of all across the board, I guess, in terms of, a 50K all the way up to Arizona Monster, which is huge. I also do a lot with tactical athletes, first responders, military personnel. So I've coached people through the GORUCK Selection, which is essentially a between 24 and 48 hour ultra endurance event that really has no guidelines or stipulations. You kind of just show up and you perform whatever they want you to perform for anywhere between 24 and 48 hours. So you kind of need to be prepared for anything, but that is a population I work with as well. I also do a lot with just couch to 5K, and that's not an exact example. I just threw that example in there because most people understand the couch to 5K is, it's kind of terminology for the beginner. So I do a little bit with beginners as well. And lastly, with Hill Pursuit, I also have a podcast where I just kind of talk about any and everything related to training, exercise, fitness, bring some guests on, and just try to help people out who are listening to, gain a nugget of insight or anything that can help them in their own coaching experience, journey, etc. And then I guess lastly, not necessarily completely irrelevant, but it has a little bit of relevance. I also just think it's the coolest thing that I do. So I run a nonprofit organization called Lives Promise. My daughter Olivia got diagnosed with cancer around 8 months old, and she's doing really well. She's cancer-free now, but we did start a nonprofit organization to raise funds and fight against childhood cancer. So that organization also hosts a couple different races. So I am in this space quite a bit, whether I'm racing, coaching, doing research, teaching, and then I also am a race director as well through that nonprofit organization. So a little bit of everything. Okay, my case study. The case that I chose was Michael Chen. He's a 42-year-old executive Ironman dreamer. I interpreted that to be executive, almost like a CEO of a large business. An Ironman dreamer, I interpreted as has the goal of completing an Ironman and maybe has no experience within the sport otherwise. So that being said, I have some assumed qualities, characteristics. Ironically, I included some pictures here. This is actually an athlete of mine. I did get his permission to include some pictures, but he's also a very he's a high achieving executive in his own right. So I actually chose to use some of his pictures, but also some of the characteristics and lifestyle habits and lifestyle qualities to kind of blend into the case that I ultimately selected. So high achiever, very, very busy at work. But because he is a high achieving executive, despite the high work demand, he has the flexibility to kind of make his own schedule. Again, no background in the sport. I interpreted that from the Ironman dreamer. He likes challenging tasks, and you'll see that from the next bullet point here. He has a history of bodybuilding. I'll dive into that a little bit more as it relates to maybe strengths, weaknesses, etc. But likes a challenge, thrives when dealing with adversity, etc. Has competed before in other things, other sports. Limited shoulder range of motion, so we have some issues with both shoulders, we'll say. Again, as a high achieving executive and as a previous bodybuilder, he does more than what is asked, almost to a fault at times. And then for purposes to make things a little easy, we'll say that he has no kids, and that's our athlete. All right, the SWOT analysis. The SWOT analysis, of course, consists of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, and some of these are actually in both categories. So for strengths, history of bodybuilding, I look at that as a strength because that clearly shows me that this athlete is resilient, has a lot of discipline to achieve a goal and work towards a goal. Getting slightly ahead of myself, I would say in weaknesses, if you look at addicted to exercise, I would say that maybe there's some crossover there, that the history of bodybuilding can be a strength in some regards, but also a weakness in others. But back to strengths, he's also, of course, high achieving, like we mentioned. He doesn't quit, and he has a flexible schedule. So weaknesses, perhaps addicted to exercise, almost to the point where you have to rein him back in, pull him back in. There's a high workload, which, again, because of his flexible schedule, doesn't influence his availability to train, but the high work demand, of course, can play into just other life stress that the athlete may be dealing with. And certainly that matters when you're accounting for the physical stress of exercise and training as well. Shoulder mobility, and then sometimes, due to the history here, emphasizing quantity over the quality of sessions. So some opportunities here because he's a beginner in the sport of triathlon. That's, again, my assumption, is that we'll see some fast progress. The onset of any exercise program, again, back to the Couch to 5K person, you'll see a lot of progress right off the bat, and I think that would be a positive reinforcement for this athlete. We would also test and retest pretty early in the program. I'll get into that as well, but things like shoulder mobility, and then some other, of course, maybe some swim, bike, run, test, retest, if there's any strength stuff that this athlete might feel is applicable, or, again, based on their history, they just kind of have a comfort with testing a 1RM or a multiple repetition maximum in the weight room. I'd be fine with that as well. Another good opportunity would be group sessions with local teammates, just to kind of learn about the sport a little bit, since they have very little experience. Some threats could potentially be too much too soon, training too much volume, thinking because of their experience and because he's a high achiever that maybe he just knows enough to kind of just do it on his own and say, hey, instead of the 5-mile run that you had programmed, I had time, so I ran 20 miles today, or something like that, right? Thinking that they know what they should be doing without actually fully having that understanding. So missing out on quality for that reason as well. In terms of goal setting, I have a couple goals here that I think are very straightforward. Complete the Ironman, right? That's the first goal, and this is certainly doable, I'll be honest. In terms of my coaching philosophy, which, of course, we're integrating in here, I feel like anybody can do this. I feel like we need, the athlete needs to be disciplined. The athlete needs to be focused on the goal, and with the right discipline, the right focus, and a proper progression over time, I truly do believe anybody can do this. So yes, of course, I think this is doable. And he also has a outstanding baseline fitness, even though it's not relevant to the sport. It is very good baseline fitness based on his history. Second goal would be improve efficiency in the water, and this needs to come with improved range of motion in the shoulders. This is very doable, but the athlete needs to put in quality over quantity. So this does require attention to detail, things like video analysis of the swim, specific swim drills, different techniques, dynamic warm-ups, and then working on range of motion of the shoulders, all things to consider in terms of water efficiency in the water. And then lastly, I created a goal that I would say is unnecessary. Let's say the athlete just randomly says, hey, let's finish this 140.6 mile Ironman in 12 hours, right? a lot of people kind of just think that that's like a great number, and of course it is, right? But there could be a little bit of imposter syndrome coming from that, and I'll dive into that in a little bit. But I do think that goal is completely unnecessary, especially for somebody who is, quote, the Ironman dreamer with little to no experience in the sport. I think there's a lot to be said for having a goal like this, and as the race would approach, we would establish maybe some time or power output, pacing output, swimming efficiency goals. But for right now, to have that goal at the onset of a year of training towards an Ironman, I think is just unnecessary. So I would help the athlete focus more primarily on just being healthy and strong across the finish line. In terms of some SMART goals and then challenges that I would see as a coach from my aspect. So I have 3 listed: a healthy training environment, sustained structure to volume and load increases, and then also improving shoulder mobility. And I'll dive into each of these here briefly, but healthy training environment for this athlete involves no more than 7 to 10 total weekly hours at the beginning of the exercise program. So this athlete is used to living in the gym, very long hours, multiple sessions, etc. Right? So this leads to something called the blender effect, where you're doing a little bit of everything, and you're doing so much that you're not really getting better at anything, and you're just kind of training for almost general health purposes, and you're not getting the benefit of, say, a strength session on the bike or in the weight room, or a speed session on the track, right? If you do too much, you're going to completely negate the physiological adaptation of those more specific sessions. So we want to avoid the blender effect. Proper fueling is also another big one for this athlete. This athlete, again, potentially, let's just assume that they have maybe a different relationship with food due to their history in bodybuilding. So maybe they're performing fasted endurance sessions, which again is not always the end of the world, up to a certain time frame, based on the metabolic demand and the metabolic efficiency of the athlete. But let's just assume that it's not a good thing for anybody. So fasted endurance sessions we need to be mindful of, and potential sports psychology impact may lead me to focus a little bit with this athlete on something like body dysmorphia. Again, if there's a weird relationship with food based on the history of bodybuilding, then that's something to consider. Following programmed load and intensity, the athlete just living in the weight room, finding any excuse to exercise, something we need to be very mindful of, that we're not wasting the time and the quality of our other sessions. So it might sound a little silly that we need to focus on progressive overload, and I know that it might, but this athlete needs to be mindful of that. They've worked towards and achieved other goals in bodybuilding, and now we need to, almost like put the reins on so that they can not overdo not the too much too fast, and ultimately drop out or lead to the catastrophe theory in terms of their burnout or overtraining. At the onset, 10% weekly increases in load or volume, I think is probably a good start. It's probably a good start for everybody, or a good principle for everybody, but it's definitely relevant for this athlete at the onset, making sure that they're not adding in extra sessions. They need to definitely plan to the deload week. Definitely plan and stick with the deload weeks for purposes mentioned above. And then I would also integrate the functional movement screen shoulder mobility test, which is actually blended into the background of this slide. You're essentially just measuring the distance between two different fists, right elbow high, left elbow low, and then the opposite as well. So we would look for discrepancies between the two, and then we would test and retest just this mobility assessment, every 6 to 8 weeks, and see how it correlates to swim performance as well. Okay, in terms of the major challenges with this athlete, I have 3. The athlete lives in the weight room. Long sessions, blender effect, we kind of spoke to that a little bit. We need to emphasize the quality over quantity. And for this reason, I'd probably take more of an academic approach and educate the athlete to avoid the negative physiological effect of doing a little bit too much of everything and not focusing on the outcome of a session or a training block. Number 2, the athlete can't really sit still. They're a very high performer. They also potentially are influenced by others and experience the imposter syndrome, or always feeling like you're not doing enough relative to somebody else. So I would take a more sports psychology approach here. You need to find out why the athlete feels the need to always be doing more or always be adding something in. What's defining this athlete? Is it the process, the finish line? Does the athlete feel like they need the praise from other people while they're doing this, or when they cross the finish? We really need to dive into why the athlete's experiencing this imposter syndrome. And then, of course, the last one is the lack of shoulder mobility. We need a very clear and established test and retest for this athlete. Daily mobility, dynamic pre, static post session, probably every single session, but definitely when in the pool. So again, key coaching focus areas would be sports psychology. The athlete expects success. They're very high achieving, but how is that specifically measured? Really need to dive into that. Second key area would be swim video analysis, shoulder mobility assessment, and reassessment. I would say this is mandatory to improve the athlete's efficiency, comfortability, economy, energy expenditure, metabolic demand, all those things, especially in the water, but just general health too, right? We need the athlete to have a healthy range of motion. And then progressive overload. And again, I know this sounds silly to say, but the athlete tends to do too much. So we need to reinforce that the athlete is not overdoing any specific area or any specific discipline. Slowly progress at the onset of the program, build to an adequate Ironman volume so that they can finish the race healthy and strong. And ultimately, as this ties into my or part of my coaching philosophy, it's essentially just meeting athletes where they're at, making sure everything is fun, and then ultimately fitting the training into the athlete's life and not the other way around, right? Because we have all these different things that we're involved in, different professions, family, kids. I guess in this case, the scenario or the case study does not have any children, but fitting training into life and not moving life to fit around training. Of course, unless we're a professional, but in this case, he's not. So making sure that we're sticking to that principle of fitting training around the demands of life. Okay, and here's our annual training plan. And I think I love the layout of this plan. I use a couple different platforms myself, but this layout actually shows both fitness and fatigue over the course of an entire calendar year. So you'll see at the bottom, the light blue blocks, then you'll see the yellow, the gray, the yellow, the gray, then you'll see the green. Each of those blocks represents 1 week. So the whole 52-week plan is in place in terms of volume, load progressions, deloads, etc. The plan starts with 9 weeks of base building. Again, the athlete has experience and a base level of fitness, but not really aerobic in nature. So roughly 9 to, you'll see two yellow blocks after that before a gray block. The gray blocks are recovery blocks. The yellow are building blocks. So you see roughly 11-ish weeks of aerobic base building, aerobic development prior to our first deload week. And you can see that represented in fatigue as well. Fatigue, you'll see almost like a linear increase those first 11 weeks, and then you'll see the natural drop in fatigue as the athlete is deloading. And then after that point, the athlete operates on a 3-up, 1-down progression, 3 weeks of build and 1 week of recovery. And again, this is a beginner Ironman athlete, so I do think that that's relevant. For more experienced athletes, you could progress to maybe a 2-month window of time where maybe they're building for 7 and down for 1, or building for 6, down for 2. So again, surrounding different competitions, of course, but I do think a 3+1 works well for this athlete. Each of the arrows you'll see are immediately following either 2 or 1 green blocks, which are tapers. For the first arrow, I'll just go through all the arrows. The first is a sprint. The second is, I believe it's 5 weeks after the sprint. 4 weeks after the sprint is the Olympic. And then you'll see 6 weeks after the Olympic is a half iron, and then you'll see the full iron 12 weeks later. So the first race being a sprint, the athlete not having race experience, a 2-week taper I felt was necessary, not just for the physical recovery of the 4 months of 3+1 up to that point, but also the mental recovery and the preparation that goes into potentially this athlete's very first race. After that 4 weeks, I only chose to have the athlete break for or deload for 1 week or taper for 1 week, because the athlete now has race experience, and we still want to maintain some quality training in between these races, even though the close proximity is a month, which I don't think is too close. But and then after that, there's 6 weeks before the the half iron. So that being the first like major endurance event for the athlete, there's another 2-week taper there. 12 more weeks and then a 2-week taper leading into the full iron. And you'll notice at the very end, above the last arrow, you'll see that fatigue is highest right before that full iron, but then it drops almost to its lowest up, since the onset of the program, almost to its lowest, where fitness is its highest to that point. So, and I'd like to take a moment and just kind of emphasize and discuss this fitness and fatigue paradigm. You'll see this fitness and fatigue paradigm comes right out of an NSCA Essentials text that I reference, quite frequently. But on the left, you'll have a general adaptation syndrome, and of course, this is something that we're all familiar with. You introduce a new program, a new exercise, whatever it is, the athlete's taking on a new sport or new challenge. Call this the alarm phase. They work against this phase. They resist it. They reach a new level of improvement. That number 3 is referred to as supercompensation. Easy numbers. If you want to look at an FTP, the athletes never performed an FTP before. They're new to cycling, and they get 200 watts, right? And then after a couple weeks, it drops because their fatigue is elevated because they're training. And then ultimately, if you deload them correctly and you reassess their FTP 6, 8, 10 weeks later, it's 210 watts, right? We see this new level of performance achieved. We do this the wrong way. You'll see phase 4. They overtrain. They just continue to drop, right? So this is why we have scientifically designed programs. This is why it's important to work with a coach. On the right, you'll see the fitness fatigue paradigm. Following any bout of training, so you'll see the block that says training stimulus, or just a training program. It could be one single acute session. It could be an entire month of 3 up, 1 down, whatever the case may be, or it could be the entire annual plan. Following that plan, there's always a level of preparedness resulting from fitness and fatigue from that session, from that week, from the month, whatever it is. And preparedness is only optimized when both of those, fitness and fatigue, when both are going away, right, or dissipating. So they both go away, right? When we have a deload week, we lose a little bit of fitness, but we also shed fatigue. And preparedness is optimized when we're shedding fatigue at a faster rate than fitness, which is what's happening in that microscope where that blue line of preparedness is highest. We're shedding fatigue at a faster rate than fitness, which is the purpose of those deload weeks. Moving on to the 4-week mesocycle. This will assume to be 4 weeks of the build phase, that initial build phase, where we see the athlete beginning to accumulate some fatigue. Again, not excessively. Each of those blocks at the bottom is 1 week, so we see them accumulating some decent fatigue in that first month. They're also, their fitness, again, dropping at the onset because this is a brand new program. As they resist against the program, or maybe not a brand new program, but a brand new type of training for this athlete, as they resist and work within the program, fitness begins to, of course, increase over time. So the objectives here within this 4-week block, the athlete needs to establish a consistent routine, right? They've been in the weight room before for hours, but now we need to kind of revisit the physiology of the body in terms of training for maybe strength, power, hypertrophy, but now we're training primarily for muscular endurance. So we need to build the aerobic base in order to sustain exercise increases in intensity and volume later. Accumulate a little bit of fatigue, but not too much that they have to quit or need to take too much time off. And then, of course, benchmark testing is going to happen. Maybe not all within this 4-week block, but it's going to start at the onset of the program. And the benchmark testing, depending on the resources we have, this is an ideal lineup in terms of my eyes. A 5K run time trial. Again, probably not one you would test right off the bat unless the athlete has experience running at all. Assuming this person does not because they were a bodybuilder, this would be something that would get tested, but probably not until 4 to 6 weeks into the program, and then not again for another 6 to 8 weeks at the earliest. Same with the swim, a 1K swim time trial. An FTP on the bike, and potentially a lactate threshold or onset of blood lactate accumulation assessment. You can do this in real time around a track. on the pool deck. You can do this on the bike at relative intensities as well, or absolute. But that just looks like you're looking for blood lactate values at 2 or 4 millimoles in terms of lactate threshold and onset of blood lactate accumulation, respectively. If we have the availability to assess a VO2 max, which I do on occasion with some of my athletes, that would be fantastic. And then, like I said, this athlete has experience in the weight room, so any 1RM or multiple repetition maximum testing I would be perfectly fine with, as long as it doesn't interfere with the rest of our training or the rest of our benchmark testing. And in terms of benchmark testing, I'd really only focus on one test, maybe per week, or 2 weeks. So again, we need to establish a base level of fitness that can sustain this type of testing. So the athlete would need to be, training for at least a month to get comfortability prior to testing. And then at that point, you kind of just cycle these tests, right? You don't do more than one of them every week to 2 weeks. And then if you revisit each test every 8 weeks, then you're kind of just always testing, but you're only testing one parameter at a time or within a 2-week window. So I think that's a very healthy way to test and retest pretty early. Of course, other benchmarks, like I mentioned, that shoulder range of motion mobility assessment as well. For our 1-week microcycle, this is one of the weeks within the initial building phase. Okay, right off the bat, you'll notice that the total TSS is 681 for the week. And according to Training Peaks, the suggested minimum for an Ironman athlete is 590 weekly TSS. And again, this is not the first week. This is not the second week. This is likely following about 4 to 6 weeks of anaerobic-based development. So I think that the 680 is roughly a healthy TSS for this athlete at this time. I also mentioned to adhere to 7 to 10 hours per week at the onset of the exercise programming. Again, this being roughly 6 to 8 weeks in, the total commitment to train being 10 hours and 17 minutes, I think is very feasible. And you'll see that as we break down what some of the sessions are. All of the sessions are 60 minutes or under, with exception of the weekend, primarily aerobic development sessions, both on the bike and, of course, running. The swim sessions, though, because this is the athlete's biggest weakness and the athlete has the most work to do in terms of improving efficiency. I have 4 weekly swim sessions. They're all 60 minutes or under. They're all primarily aerobic in nature with time and availability for drill and technique work. There are a couple threshold efforts. When I say a couple, there are very few, but there are literally a couple. So that, of course, we're training, the metabolic demand is there for more threshold-based efforts, but we don't necessarily have the capacity to center an entire session around threshold efforts yet for this athlete. There are 4 bike sessions, all 60 minutes or under, again, with the exception of the long effort on the weekend, a couple small zone 3 efforts, and again, depending on the type of race that this athlete is building towards, we would either simulate, some slow climbs, low cadence, long sustained climbing efforts, or we would tease out these zone 3 efforts at a moderate to high cadence, and that just varies based on the race that the athlete would ultimately be racing in for their half iron and their Ironman. 3 quality run sessions. We also have 1 small runoff. Again, the runoff not really there for training purposes necessarily, but there for comfortability purposes. The athlete needs to experience what their body feels like after these long sustained bike rides. And this one is just a zone 2, essentially bike ride. So the legs after a long sustained zone 2 aren't going to be crazy, but it's still going to be a new feel for the athlete. It might feel a little heavy, a little slow at first, but this is something that the athlete needs to build familiarity with quite regularly. So again, just 15 minutes I think is sufficient at this time in the program. The quality run sessions, one introduces a tempo. It's very short, but there is a tempo focus, again, to get the athlete's mind around what the effort might feel like on a race day. Again, starting off very, very small, but there is an emphasis of tempo at some point. And then lastly, what I think is unique to this athlete, perhaps not to every athlete, but to this one, are the 2 weekly strength sessions. There's a functional light lower body and posterior chain session. There's also a lower body hamstring dominant plus a power session for this athlete. primarily focused on general physical preparedness and just prepping the athlete for intensity and load volume increases, sport specificity increases that will come later in their annual training block. Let's break down a single daily session. We have a single daily session, again, roughly 8 weeks into the onset of their program in aerobic-based development that does have a swim, a bike, and a run, right? So we're completing a triathlon pretty early in the program here, but you'll actually see that they're all fairly short sessions and have a great opportunity for drilling and familiarity with what might be expected on the race, again, depending on the race. But for the swim session, 1,700 meters, upper body warm-up, kick warm-up, and an emphasis on the fingertip drill, which of course emphasizes the athlete's shoulder and elbow position, which of course directly connect and are inherently linked to one another. So if the athlete is emphasizing shoulder position in the water along with or as part of this fingertip drill as an example, then the athlete's also focused on again, indirectly, but they are focused on the shoulder position, mobility, range of motion, etc. So a great drill for this athlete to continuously work on while in the water. And then you'll see, if we were to have clicked into the swim session, there's, I believe it's, 5 by 200, resting 30 seconds, described as zone 4 for the first 100, then zone 3 for the second 100. This is somewhat of a simulated aerobic race feel, and we actually switch this and swap the effort later in the week, beginning with a zone 3 for the first 100 and a zone 4 for the second 100. Again, just kind of stressing the metabolic demand in the water in different capacities in varied ways, so that the athlete doesn't get too comfortable and also simulates what might be expected while swimming in open water with a varying, again, based on position in the group. Essentially, you're gonna have varied efforts throughout. The bike has an incrementally increasing 20-minute effort as the warm-up prior to a strength endurance set, which involves a low cadence effort at 40 to 60 RPMs for 8 minutes twice. So we're just a sustained zone 3 effort at low cadence. Again, the specificity of this type of an effort would be dictated by the type of race that the athlete is ultimately training for, and then just kind of cooling down. Again, this bike is an hour with really only a 2 by 12 minute work interval. So again, you see 3 sessions daily for the athlete, but the actual work intervals, and you'll see that with the run as well, are quite low. The run, the goal is to just get comfortable with a potential race tempo pace. The 15-minute zone 3 effort is all we're looking for here. We're warming up prior to that. We're cooling down after. And again, the 15-minute effort is just a sustained zone 3 to train the heart to hold this intensity. And then we'll begin to tease that out over time so that the athlete can build on what this potential race effort may feel like. In summary, the overall approach does involve a heavy amount of sports psychology. We need to calibrate the volume of training for this athlete based on what he's already familiar with so that we can ensure quality while slowly progressing the quantity of training for the athlete. We have to retest not just shoulder mobility, but a little bit of everything in terms of those benchmark tests that we just described. And swim efficiency is big. So we need swim quantity, but we need every single session. And you'll notice none of the sessions that I highlighted in that first block were more than 2,200 meters. So they're relatively quick, all under an hour for the athlete. We need to emphasize the quantity of the swim sessions, but within each of the swim sessions, the quality needs to be emphasized. Shoulder and elbow range of motion and mobility need to be emphasized. We need to avoid too much too soon for the athlete. We need valuable race experience. So that's why we're starting sprint Olympic half iron prior to the full. We have to emphasize adequate recovery, especially during the later blocks. Not so much in the early blocks, but we need to emphasize in those early blocks that we can't be, we need to stay away from the blender effect or doing too much too soon and losing out on the physiological adaptations from the previous sessions by just doing too much outside of those program sessions. Unique circumstances, high achieving athlete, freedom to schedule training, but the time is valuable and there's a lot of work and life stress that's involved, shoulder issues, and maybe getting bored with exercise and just needing constant variability. So the athlete does require quite a lot and I think we've established a pretty good program to get this athlete towards the finish line. That's all I have. Again, my name is Hayden, and if you ever want to reach out to me, I'm happy to have a conversation. I'm always looking to expand my network. There's an email for me, just hillpursuit@gmail.com. Again, that's my business contact. I'm perfectly fine if you message me there or find me on any of the socials, anything like that. And again, I'm always looking to expand my network and look for new relationships, athletes, coaches, any and everyone in between. So I appreciate your time, and I'm happy to take some questions. Thanks.